Hi everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm yet another of Giles's minions. Finishing up my PhD and planning to submit really soon. So essentially today what I'm going to be talking about is a bit of a review that's in progress with Barbara Wilson and Mark Garkaklis, who some of you would have known have done the majority of the legwork on looking at how mammals and fauna are impacted by Phytophthora. And so the idea of this presentation is really to put into perspective in the bigger picture of how Phytophthora might be contributing to global fauna decline. Oh, we've lost it. And this picture here sums up a lot of the impacts really well. So if you can keep that in your mind, generally we have a more open understory where animals might be predated more, there will be less habitat. We have a dead grass tree in the front. Grass trees are in a lot of parts of Australia and they're really essential habitat for small mammals and for reptiles, and they're really good pollinators for a lot of different animals. Behind that, there's a dead banksia, and if we go into a bit more detail on that, again, it's another pollinator, and they're almost completely lost inside of a lot of infestations. And so really what I'm going to do is give a bit of a background overview of what the literature stage is at. What do we actually know? I'm going to be presenting basically a summary of every single species that we have enough data to have an idea of what might be happening to them. These are in studies in journals or in theses. So basically, I don't have any idea of what's been done on the ground if people have done ecological surveys and it's sitting in your databases. If you've actually looked at mammals or fauna or any sort of animals and Phytophthora, we don't really know what's about that. So please come to me if you do have anything on that. And then also if you want to know anything about specific species or specific groups of animals that pop up on here, then please come to me and I can provide you with that publication or that journal or point you in a direction of more details on that. So this map here shows where all the studies that have been done and all the individual and unique animals that have at least 10 abundance or have been the focus of research in these areas. So in Perth region, we have the Northern Jarrah forests and the Banksia woodlands. That's where most of the research has been done. We have down south in the Cape Reach and Stirling Ranges. We have Anglesey, which was done a lot by Barbara Wilson and Laidlaw, and also the Brisbane Ranges. So this is mostly heathland areas and woodland and forest, and we don't really know what's happening in a lot of the other areas of Australia. So if I put a rough distribution mapping of where Phytophthora is, you can see where the massive gaps are. And again, the important thing to note is that a lot of these animals have only been studied a single time, sometimes with low abundance. So we have an idea, but we really can't give you a confident idea of what's happening. Some might have shown that they're not being impacted, but there's a likelihood that they actually are impacted in other areas. So they're isolated studies, and there's a lot of areas like Tassie, massively infested, your eastern coast, even the northeast coast, that we have absolutely no idea what's happening to fauna around these areas. So I'm going to go through individually on each of these groups and just disseminate the negative impacts and focus a bit more on that, and also maybe some of the positive impacts that some animals that might colonize these areas. And just before I move on from going on to that, we're focusing on Australia because there's only one study that has actually been done outside of Australia on this. So we know that there's a lot of areas like South Africa, Spain, America that do have a lot of Phytophthora cinnamomi, but in general, a lot of plant pathogens around the world really haven't had any implications of what happens to the fauna as a result of this. So we'll include that a little bit. But yeah, so first up is the birds, which seem to be the least impacted. This is generally because a lot of these birds are using trees that were surviving. So in the case of the Jarrah forest, the Maori tend to survive, sometimes in lower numbers inside of the infestations. So these are abundance surveys where they walked through and they could see the birds in there. Generally, those that are losing habitat are being suggested to have vegetation loss of trees, loss of shrubs. You may have a loss of flowers. We haven't really looked into that in detail, as most of these have been some older studies. Of note is the rainbow bee-eater, which are actually disturbance colonizers, and they burrow into the sand to make their nests. So twice they've been studied and they've actually been found in higher abundances. But what we really want to focus more on is those ones that are actually losing their habitat. And even the ones that might not be impacted, while they might have been found in there, there's been no studies on how they're foraging or their presence and their time returning into the infestations. So they could also be negatively impacted. Moving on to invertebrates, a lot of the studies have been done on orders rather than individual species. And invertebrates are really important because declines in invertebrates will impact the rest of the food web, because we have detritivores, we have seed removal, seed movement, and then they provide food for a lot of other animals. So in the middle, we have some insects, as well as this is the case that happen in Spain, where there's less leaf litter, you might expect less invertebrates. Otherwise, they seem to be doing okay, but we still don't know what's happening if there's a loss of flowers for pollinators and what's happening to the pollinators. We don't know if there's less food resources. And then I'm going on to a little bit of a case study after this, but there are actually some inverts that are at extinction risk, like the scales or the plant louse. So in this example here, this is a lot of work by Melinda Moore. She's done, I think, 3 studies, and there's another one on this where basically there's a little plant louse that is only living on Banksia montana, which is on the Stirling Ranges. So there's these 2 populations where those arrows are pointing to on peaks, and you can see in this high confidence mapping of Phytophthora that it's completely surrounded. In that picture there, there's an isolated Banksia. And so basically what's happening is that this little invert is at extinction risk of Phytophthora. It's the first evidence of extinction risk from Phytophthora cinnamomi. And I think this is really important for these really short-range endemic animals. And it's important that we know where the critical areas are to actually focus on our study, our restoration, perhaps even translocation of populations. For our reptiles, moving on, a lot of what they eat is invertebrates. So less invertebrates, possibly less reptiles. Now, they tend to be more negatively impacted. This is from a loss of low vegetation, a lot of less shrubs, less grass trees, and also when you have less leaf litter and logs that they're using. And this has implications with fire. So if you're burning in an infestation, you remove all of your microhabitat, all of your coarse woody debris. And then when you have less plants in there, there might be less regeneration of this coarse woody debris because you have less trees. There's less actual input of this habitat sources in there. Some actually prefer them because they're basking, but again, we don't know what's happening if they're foraging less and if there's less food in here. With mammals, almost every single time we've studied them, they've been negatively impacted. And this is a lot of the time attributed to a loss of grass trees. So antechinus are very consistently negatively impacted. They rely heavily on those tall grass trees to have a little arboreal nest in. And we have a loss of, again, the logs. In the honey possum scenario, down in the southwest in Cape Rich and in the Stirling Ranges, they lose their Banksias, and that's a really, really important habitat source for them. So they're doubly impacted from the loss of flowering food sources and from the loss of vegetation. So what might be happening with things like mammals, which have a bit of a wider range than reptiles, is that they might be maybe moving over these areas, but they could be pushed out and they could have more competition for space and resources around these infestations, especially if they have natural restrictions. And again, what Cecilia is going to be talking about next is that there's possibly increased predation risk of these animals inside of infestations because there's less refuge and habitat. So they're more vulnerable when they're walking through there. So what I've been doing with a lot of my PhD is studying quendas. So this is Isodon fusciventa. It's a bandicoot, which is native to the southwest. And this is an animal that it seems to be partially resilient. But there's a big reason for that. So quendas are urban adapters. You all might know them as going in backyards, digging up areas. So they're actually doing okay and able to move through these semi-degraded areas. Melissa Danks did her honours thesis on this, and in a small area of small patchy infestations, quendas were found to be essentially moving across them and not really caring as much when there's a small infestation. What I found and I presented on last year was that there's a massively reduced amount of habitat, so 45% less grass tree refuges, and this is grass trees that specifically have nests and skirts that will touch the ground, as well as low shrub cover. And then coordinated with this, there's 33% digging density. So this was over the course of a year. So we can be pretty confident that over the course of the year, the quendas were entering in there at least to find food less. We did find that they were nesting in grass trees still, and that's pretty expected because they do tend to move through partially open areas, lawns, these semi-degraded areas. But it sort of brings up the question of if our quendas actually partially resilient to habitat loss. So this year and last year, my final study, I've been going through and tracking quendas. So I've been getting little GPSs and gluing them onto their bums. And then what they also have is a VHF radio transmitter. So I've been walking around and trying to find these needles in a haystack. And when I say it's a needle in a haystack, it is legitimately very, very hard to find sometimes with the canopy, the buildings, bouncing radio everywhere. So a lot of the animals ended up being in backyards like that one. So when I get these GPSs, I could go and look at where they were moving and also look at their habitat ranges. So on the left, you have a very short quenda path. Unfortunately, because of the nature of the fences and also the quendas grooming off their trackers, they didn't stay on for very long, and I couldn't get a very confident idea of how they were using their habitats. But you can see that they're moving in and out of houses a lot. In the center, you have some mapping that I've done. This is based on a lot of Joe's mapping that he did in Mundaring, when I have an idea of if their home ranges, or in this case, just their movement ranges, what percentage of those was overlapping with infestations, with urban areas, and with healthy areas. And so in general, because of the short tracking times, we didn't get really a consistent idea of if they're avoiding infestations, but that's sort of a good result because it means that they're actually moving over them and they're partially resilient. Although I did get lower capture rates within infestations. So these are large infestations. They're a lot larger than the ones that Melissa Danks looked at in Jandakot. And so we can assume from that it's possible that they may be entering there or just spending less time in infested areas because there's less habitat. So overall, they could be partially resilient by moving across and utilizing remnant habitats like grass trees. So it's really important that they're kept alive. But it's likely that they're less favorable compared to surrounding habitat because they're foraging less, there's lower capture rates, and they could just be using gardens as well to supplement their habitat. So an area out in the middle of the bush, they might completely avoid infestations because they have to move elsewhere where their food is. Whereas in this case, they can just go in someone's backyard and go into a chicken coop. So to summarize sort of everything, the important takeaways are that mammals and reptiles tend to be consistently negatively impacted. This is because both of them rely a lot on your vegetation and your microhabitat of your logs. Pollinators can lose flowers, but this hasn't really had much research. And invertebrate declines may impact other trophic levels of the food web, and this is often associated with leaf litter decline. So we have fewer fauna. This might be a loss of ecosystem processes like pollination, movement of spores and grains. You might have less decomposition, and then this might mean further ecosystem decline, and it'll keep spiraling, and then maybe less reason for fauna to go in, less natural recovery of any sort of plant species in there. And overall, there is just a lack of data. So again, I just want to reiterate that a lot of what I've presented here is a single study, or it's one animal, one area, or it's just in a really isolated spot. So if we bring up that map again, what do we actually need to know on this? I think we need to fill in a lot of these gaps. And with research, we tend to just go in one area. And I think the problem, unfortunately, has been that a lot of the research on animals and Phytophthora cinnamomi has been in theses, which are just in one little constricted area. So there's a lot of areas that we don't know, especially globally. I think importantly, we need to know what's happening to the conservation threatened species and significant areas. So at the very start of the day, we had these maps of what are the significant areas. Sterling ranges is one perfect example of that. And there's a lot of animals that rely on that heathland very heavily. You've got a lot of constricted and unique animals that live down there. And it's also an important habitat link between a lot of areas in a big corridor. And finally, there's the question of, can we actually return usable habitat? So for the long term, can we restore these areas? Because they're not really recovering on their own. And in the short term, perhaps we can put in artificial refuges. This is something when I had the privilege to go over to Victoria, to the Otways, and we helped to set up some little tunnels for paddy melons, and they ended up using them. And this was an area that was being constricted by invasive tea trees that was coming off the back of an infestation. So there's a potential for actually providing short-term habitat for the time being. Just the bottom line really of this whole speech right now is A, we need more research, we need more knowledge, but B, what you guys can do is we can actually protect and preserve habitat, and that's the real important thing for the time being. We need to get more investigation of like what are the critical areas and what do we need to focus on, what animals and what species we need to focus on, as well as their crucial habitats. So I'd like to bring that to a close, and I have a big acknowledgement to my co-authors, the Shire of Mundaring, Joe for the mappings, my supervisors, and then a whole load of volunteers to help with my tracking. And thank you very much, everyone.
Running a little bit behind it. I've got time for one question.
Quendas. So the question was if the quendas move Phytophthora. I was going to include a slide in this because I get this question literally every time. As far as we know, no, there's been one sort of work done on that in my lab group where they were swabbing the feet of quendas and they never got a positive isolate. Pigs move it because they're moving mud. Hooved animals move it because they're moving mud. Pigs can also move it when they eat roots as well, infested roots, and that's actually something that might be happening with your native animals. But if the native animals were moving it, it would be everywhere because they're in higher abundance usually. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tom. Very important work.